Time now to take a look at Easter Monday's papers. Joining us now from Belfast, the co-founder of Challenges NI, Thomas Copeland, and from Swansea, the sociologist Ashley Frawley. Guys, it's lovely to see you. I hope you're both coping very, very well indeed under these strict lockdown situations. But we're getting our money's worth out of you this morning. Ashley, we're going to come straight to you first. Let's start, shall we, with them. At page 2 of the Times, and something which some people have been calling for quite some time, a contact tracing app being set up by the NHS.
Yeah, so Apple and Google have been working with the NHS to develop an app that will allow for those who've tested positive to notify the app, and then it will use Bluetooth technology to trace at least other people with whom your phone has been in contact, so other phones that have been in the vicinity, and then give a notification to tell you to self-isolate. And I think this is, I think it's good that we're thinking outside of the box here. I think governments have often been quite behind when it comes to new technologies. On the other hand, I think we need to be a bit careful, and there's been some other coverage, for instance, by The Guardian, that's been a little bit more suspicious, for the lack of a better word, about the sort of privacy concerns. And you have to think, like, these sorts of interventions are being introduced without parliamentary scrutiny. This is serious tracking of the population's private lives. It's an emergency measure, and it may work. It's been shown to be a positive intervention, or at least an effective intervention in places like China. But on the other hand, I've got a friend working at a university in China, and he was telling me in February, they're using our phones to track us. And you can just imagine, when could they start to use this to trace the transmission of subversive ideas and so on. So, you can imagine that these technologies could be used for more nefarious purposes if they stick around. And actually, history has shown us that emergency interventions during wartime, or, for instance, 9/11 legislation did have a tendency to stick around and to be used and to sort of expand their use to areas where they were never intended to. So although this might be a positive development, I mean, everybody's, interested in anything that will get us to an exit strategy. I think we just need to be a little bit careful thinking about, this is an emergency measure and there needs to be an endpoint to it.
Well, let's just bring Thomas on that point. And actually, we can link that to our next story, in fact, Thomas. I mean, yeah, part of the reason for this app is we all want to get out of lockdown as soon as is practical, as soon as is possible. Apps like that will be part of it. Another aspect of it is, of course, the story on the front page of the Telegraph, the warnings that we will be hearing from the Chancellor, that extended period in lockdown is really going to have a more than significant effect on our economy.
That's absolutely right. This is the emerging battle, really, that we're seeing in Cabinet and in lots of other places as well, as to when we come out of lockdown. The quote today in the Telegraph is that the Chancellor is expected to warn Cabinet colleagues that they need to find the right balance between maintaining the lockdown and protecting the economy. The estimates that we saw last week were that every day that we maintained in lockdown at around 30% reduced national output was costing the country about £2.4 billion a day. Now, the potential of this is enormous, and I don't think it's been really grasped yet. It looks like some of the estimates we're seeing is that GDP for the year as a whole could be down could see a contraction of around 10%, which would be 2 times worse than was seen at the worst of the financial crisis in 2008 to 2009. And obviously, the people at the bottom of the ladder are disproportionately affected by these kind of recessions. And the really important thing, and the figure that's been said today in the Telegraph, is that actually it could be a recession that causes even more upset, even more hardship, even more death to the population in the United Kingdom, and certainly globally as well. The figure today is estimates are 150,000 people could die due to the economic effects of the coronavirus, aside from the virus itself. I mean, people were incredulous at the very start of this process when Donald Trump asked the question, is the cure worse than the virus? And certainly there are very few people out there who would be advocating anything other, really, than what we're doing now. But this is going to have enormous consequences in the long term. The good news, I suppose, is that this is something that's happening globally. So every country in the world is equally affected. And also in terms of where the UK is economically, this intervention from the government, which is one of the most comprehensive across, comparable Western developed countries, will feel a lot more like spending rather than long-term debt.
I just want to kind of move us on because we've got a few stories, but actually one we can link to that, Ashley. Well, we heard Thomas talking about the global dimension to all of this, and yes, we must be mindful of those who are at the bottom rung of the ladder in this country, but we also need to remember that there will be those, particularly in parts of Africa, who will be even worse off than the worst off in this country.
Absolutely, and that links to the Financial Times, the front page. They're talking about G20 nations being close to sealing a debt deal with poorer countries, because poorer countries right now are facing not only a health crisis but also debt crises, international debt, as well as domestic debts. Because this is the law of unintended consequences. When you try to focus on one policy outcome, inevitably, it's a bit like a dam. You try to sort of block one crack, and then a million other cracks start appearing. Society is incredibly complex. It goes without saying that global economies are incredibly complex, and the knock-on effect has been astonishing. So if you look at India, for example, and Bangladesh, as soon as orders stopped coming in from Western countries, you had tons of poorer workers thrown out of work, and then you had lockdowns, and it was you had over 400 million people trying to walk home, and it was the exact opposite of social distancing, and so these measures, it really have shown the divide between not just the rich and the poor in the West, but also globally, and in somewhere like India, it seems like a luxury to be able to say, well, better safe than sorry, let's work from home. It's a bit like, let them work from home, let them eat cake. 430 million people, nowhere to go, nothing to do. And when you looked at interviews of those people that were saying, are you worried about coronavirus? And they're like, I'm worried I'm going to starve. I'm worried I'm going to die on this trip.
Indeed. Thomas, I wonder if we could skip ahead to your last story of this particular section, the story in the Daily Mail, page 10. Sweet dreams in lockdown. I mean, I don't know about how you're sleeping these days, but frankly, my dreams, Freud would have a field day right now.
Well, because people have been saying this, and I'm afraid I can't sympathise. My sleep pattern has been fairly the same as it always has been, I'm afraid. But the story is, figures from a poll show that 62% of us are sleeping as well as or better than before. And I thought the most concerning section of this story was that experts had found that many of us were having, as you say, unusually vivid dreams, quote, with some about the crisis featuring Boris Johnson. Now, I don't want to ask too many questions about quite how Boris Johnson is manifesting itself in the nightmares or indeed dreams of Britons across the country. I think that's a private matter. But nonetheless, it might well be a campaign tactic we see at the next election, some sort of dream campaigning. Who knows?
Well, all I can say is, as someone who has just come off the back of a fortnight's holiday, who then had to set his alarm for 2:30 this morning, I can speak for the next 3 hours of my time on telly about the problems with sleeping. But we're going to have to leave both of you there. We will see you again next hour. Ashley, Thomas, thanks very much indeed. As promised, time now to take a look at Bank Holiday Easter Monday papers. Joining us from Belfast, the co-founder of Challenges NI, Thomas Copeland, and from Swansea, the sociologist Ashley Frawley. Good to see you again, guys. Time is of the essence, so let's dive on in. And Ashley, you've gone with the Guardian front page for your story. Ministers under fire. What for?
For the lack of protective kit or PPE, as the death toll reaches 10,000. So, in spite of assurances early on from the government that they had a plan in place, that they had, they were prepared for emergency measures like this, it's quite clear now that doesn't appear to be the case, not entirely anyway. It seems like they were more concerned about saying the right thing than perhaps doing the right thing. I mean, that said, I grant that there are problems with supply chain. But what I think this really shows up is the shocking lack of global cooperation between governments. If you think back to the eradication of smallpox, you had the USSR collaborating with the West in support of this goal of certified eradication. Now, granted, that took several decades to finally accomplish, but you would hope, we're seeing massive and extraordinary collaboration between global scientists, and you would hope that by this point in history, governments would be following suit, but that doesn't appear to be the case.
Thomas, pretty clearly, we need many, many, many units of the PPE. I mean, one cardiologist we have had on the show before, Dr. Dominic Pimento, suggesting that one patient in intensive care requires as many, well, each individual treating them requires as much as 30 separate sets of the PPE every single day. And perhaps there is no place where the pressure on PPE is more extreme than in the care home sector right now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Part of the problem appears to be is that there's a fairly, internationally, there's a limited supply of PPE, and you've got countries across the world who are essentially acting like cowboys in the Wild West. I mean, we're hearing stories of pieces of PPE being taken from airstrips in one country and transferred to another country. So I definitely echo Ashley's point about international cooperation. Domestically, we've known for a while now that care homes are the ticking time bomb of this crisis. Not enough has been done right from the start. The Daily Mail is reporting today that the government has been blasted as reckless, dangerous and immoral because of one particular policy in particular, which is that care homes are now being asked to accept patients who are discharged from hospital back into care homes in order to free up beds in the hospital. But the problem is there's been no testing of those patients when they leave hospital to check if they still have the virus. And also we're unsure about immunity, so they could get it again. So if we actually think about that, what's happening is that vulnerable elderly people who have or may potentially still have coronavirus are being put back into care homes where they're surrounded by more vulnerable elderly people who we know are the most susceptible to this virus. One expert in the Daily Mail today is calling it like playing Russian roulette with people's lives. And this is in a context where, I mean, I have a huge amount of sympathy for the complexity and the strain on the system across government and indeed globally. But this individual policy is manifestly unsafe, in a context where deaths in care homes aren't being declared in the same way that they are for other patients in the NHS for fairly, understandable reasons. And care staff themselves are being asked to turn up to work every day untested. And this is a policy that has to change.
Yeah, and I'd urge anyone with an interest in what's going on in our care sector, social care sector at the moment, to check in with our correspondent Nick Martin. He's been doing some fantastic work on that. But Ashley, you and I have talked in the past, before this era of COVID-19, about the effect that fake news, that disinformation can have on people. Interesting story in The Guardian online. I mean, you can't move these days on social media without some idiot talking about 5G.
Yeah, so the Facebook has said that it's taking aggressive steps to halt misinformation about 5G infrastructure and calls to illegal direct action to damage that infrastructure. And so they've removed a bunch of Facebook groups that were calling for direct action and were spreading misinformation and lies about 5G. But actually, I just checked Facebook, and these groups have popped up again. And if anything, there are more of them. I mean, these posts are everywhere. I actually walked in on my husband watching a lecture, like a conspiracy theory lecture on 5G. And he dropped his phone. It was like me walking in on him, cheating on me. And he goes, "It's not what it looks like," because these posts are all over his Facebook newsfeed. They're in his WhatsApp feed, and he was just kind of curious, so he clicked on it. It's tempting to just kind of ban these groups, but then the posts kind of reappear. The groups reappear. And in fact, the attempt to ban them is seen as confirmation of the depth of the conspiracy. So what do we do? I think the thing is that these conspiracy theories and their proliferation really speak to a distrust in official institutions, unfortunately, and that's not something that's easy to deal with. Perhaps, some kind of, we need more positive kind of social change that's holistic and more inclusive in terms of groups in society, instead of sort of treating certain people and certain groups as just outcasts and stupid and low information and so on, which, once you're already outside of society, it's easy to fall into this kind of thinking and into these subgroups. And I feel like that's something that we need to think about. That's a much more difficult step than just banning posts on Facebook.
Indeed. Thomas, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you now to choose a story in the papers that actually puts a smile on my face for once. Let's go to the front page of The Sun and Boris Johnson's Angels. Not quite Charlie's Angels, but Bojo's Angels.
Yeah, I mean, classic pun from The Sun, or a good title from The Sun. There, this is two individual nurses that Boris Johnson picked up on his really quite emotional recorded message. One called Jenny from New Zealand, and one called Luis from Portugal. And this had me thinking. It was only mere weeks before the COVID-19 crisis exploded that a really big debate that we were having in this country was about changes to our immigration service and this new Australian-style point system that we were talking about. And now, the entire narrative around politics has changed. We're valuing the NHS in a way that we've probably only ever valued the armed forces before, in terms of people putting themselves at risk and on the front line. Now, many health experts had looked at the immigration policies that were laid out earlier in the year and suggested that they would pose significant challenges to the NHS,
Thomas?
and in particular the social care service.
Thomas, I'm really sorry. The one story that you've been telling us that puts a smile on my face, and I'm actually having to cut you short. Thomas, Ashley, thankfully, we will get another chance to talk to you next hour. For now, though, thank you very much indeed. Time now to take a look at Easter Monday's papers. Joining us this morning from Belfast, the co-founder of Challenges Northern Ireland, Thomas Copeland, and from Swansea, the sociologist Ashley Frawley. Guys, lovely to see you again. Gentlemen first. Gentlemen first this time. Let's go for it. Thomas, your first story this morning's on the front of the Telegraph, and I have to say it is something that, as I've been off the past few days, I've been dwelling quite a lot upon. The effect that this is having on the mental health of practically everyone, really, these days.
That's right. We talked a little earlier about the economic effects of lockdown. Well, what about the mental health effects as well? So Jackie Doyle-Price, who's our former Minister for Suicide, has written in the Daily Telegraph today about her concerns that the lockdown is having on the mental health of people who are stuck in their houses for extended periods of time. For me as well, of particular concern is people who are perhaps in abusive relationships, domestic violence, and also vulnerable children are being highlighted here, for whom school is normally a primary form of care. Now, add on to that the stress and the anxiety that all of us are feeling at the moment, and those who are losing jobs, maybe struggling to pay the rent. Again, the thoughts of people who are stuck in a small apartment, those with, a garden to go out to are very, very lucky. And if you're stuck inside, maybe in the centre of London, that can be enormously stressful as well. It would not surprise me at all, and indeed it doesn't surprise Jackie Doyle-Price, that potentially we could see suicide rates rising dramatically as the lockdown continues and in the time after that. And we know as well that a recession, which appears almost inevitable, can lead to increased mental ill health, poverty rates, and suicide. So this is an emerging debate. What is the cost of this lockdown? And I'd be prepared to see a lot more of it in Cabinet and on the airwaves.
Yeah, Ashley, just a thought from you on that topic. It is perhaps the focus has been on physical health, exercise, and all the debate around what the police are doing. But mental health is a huge factor in all this. As I say, I'm one of the lucky ones in that I get to come to work, that there's a bit of routine. But even I, on 2 weeks off, with my son to keep me company, I was really beginning to feel the mental effects of what is essentially prolonged isolation.
Yeah, I mean, human beings are social beings. It's not necessarily good at all to be isolated from other people, and particularly for those with pre-existing mental health conditions. Obviously, there are going to be some serious issues. People who are homeless, there are significant increases in mental health problems amongst the homeless population. I'm a little concerned, though, about transforming the economic crisis, which is undoubtedly going to result from this, into a health problem. You don't need to transform it into like a health issue to see that it is very bad. It's not, going into recession is not good for working people, and it doesn't. You don't have to count up the deaths and weigh things up to say being unable to find a job, struggling to feed your family, precarity. None of these things are particularly good. And when you define it as a health problem, the solution becomes a health solution, right? So it's a medical solution. Whereas if you define these as social or economic problems, we need to come together as a society to try and reduce inequalities. We need to have some sort of economic game plan that betters the situation. I've seen a lot of sort of therapeutic entrepreneurs kind of picking up on this transformation of the lockdown into a mental health issue. And I'm a little bit worried about that because, there's a lot of anxiety and stress that just exists in the population at any given time, and particularly now, that may not necessarily require treatment from professionals, but requires solutions and serious thought about an exit strategy.
Well, Ashley, take us to your story inside the Daily Mail. Page 3, I think it is. Pale as a ghost.
Yeah, so Daily Mail columnist Sarah Vine says, now it's vital that Boris Johnson rests. And it's at the very beginning, she says, under normal circumstances, the fact that the Prime Minister rose miraculously from his sickbed on Easter Sunday might have felt rather too much like the work of an over-imaginative spin doctor. I don't think even the most shameless spin doctor would risk comparing Boris Johnson to Jesus. But certainly, I mean, but yeah, it's just certainly it wasn't very heartening. The government was trying to give a sense of assurance or reassurance to the population by saying, Prime Minister is still running things from his sickbed. And I think a lot of people were thinking, that's having the opposite effect. If ever there was an excuse to kind of step back from a crisis situation, it would be when you are fighting what is a deadly virus. And so I think, it's a good thing now that he does appear to be stepping back, although he did address the country via video and he was looking quite ashen. And I think it's, the Vine is absolutely right that, he needs to rest and recuperate. And actually that is much more reassuring to the country than promising that he's still working while deathly ill.
Thomas, take us to the front of the Daily Mail. An emerging part of the narrative over the past couple of weeks has been the provision of protective equipment for frontline healthcare staff. Now, it strikes me that part of the problem in all of this is that the manufacturing base for much of the PPE that we use is all the way over there in China, where this COVID-19 outbreak basically started.
That's right. And more than that, there's a limited supply of PPE at any one stage, and you've got every single government on the world who's on the hunt to get hold of it. It feels a bit like the Wild West, and there have been all sorts of dirty tricks being rumoured about, sovereign countries almost stealing PPE from other countries and orders that are on their way or on the airstrip. Add into that the mix that, as you say, China is the principal producer of PPE. And to some extent, China is using this as a form of diplomacy to cover up its early mismanagement of the crisis. I mean, countries like Italy, in some senses, quite rationally, are hailing and celebrating supplies that are coming from Beijing. And as that happens, we start to forget those early assurances that came from China that COVID-19 was, first of all, not transferable through humans, then that it was had a very low infection rate. We forget about the early silencing of whistleblowers who tried to raise the alarm about how serious this was going to be. And all of a sudden, what we talk about instead is how China is doing a fantastic job of supporting the rest of the globe. So the Daily Mail is reporting that much of the kit that's coming in from China to the NHS through daily airlifts, they say that some of it is unusable. The NHS is surviving almost hand to mouth by daily airlifts coming in from China, which can prove at times to be very erratic. I mean, the lesson here seems to be that what countries need to do is establish reliable supply chains. It's never going to be feasible to maintain, huge stores of PPE at any one stage because these things go out of date. But what needs to happen is reliable supply chains that aren't under an enormous amount of strain, and then domestic production as well. In some aspects, the heart of this problem, like you said at the very beginning, is getting huge amounts of this kit from across the globe is a very tricky business.
Ashley, I wonder if we could go, for a bit of light relief perhaps, to your last story of the day. Page 13 of the Mirror. Won't anyone think about the celebrities, Ashley? They're under lockdown. They're suffering the most in all of this.
Yeah, so there's a lot of images of the terrible struggles of celebrities sunbathing in their gigantic back gardens, the trials of baking, and of course Dame Joan Collins fresh out of the bath with a full face of makeup reading her own book. As you do. Maybe when this is all over, we can just not tell them that it's over and they can all just stay home.
But they're just so much better than us, Ashley. You've got to bear that in mind. Thomas, take us to the inside pages of The Sun. Supermum. She's been panic buying.
I love this story. So this is a woman called Sue Radford, and she has, wait for it, 22 children. Yes, that's right, 22. So we've all been to the shops, and when you nip into the shop to get a few essentials, you sometimes see, somebody with an enormous haul, and we judge them a little bit for panic buying. Well, Sue says that every shopping trip for her looks like panic buying. The paper today has a little list of what her shopping list looks like. Included on there is 100 nappies, 16 loaves of bread, get this, 114 pints of milk, 80 chicken nuggets. So the lesson is, if you're in the shop and you see somebody with an enormous trolley full of supplies, it might be somebody with upwards of 20 children rather than a selfish individual who wants 80 chicken nuggets for his tea.
I have to say, Thomas, when you started saying 114 pints, my mind went in a different direction to milk, I'm afraid. Whilst I've got you really briefly,
With
both
that many
of you.
kids, you'd need it.
Exactly. Just whilst we've got you really briefly, Ashley, how are you coping? You doing all right through all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 small children, and I thought it would be a really great idea to sleep train them and try to get them to stay in their beds the whole night. So I haven't slept in 7 days. I've been seeing news reports that people are getting lots more sleep now, and I'm just thinking, these people are in heaven and I'm in hell. But by the end of this, I'll have 15 years of perfect sleep until they're out all night as teenagers. So taking the opportunity now.
Yeah, sorry, Ashley, just to point, that's not going to happen. So apologies for that. Ashley, Thomas, we don't have time to ask how you're doing, but I'm assuming you're doing fine. You're looking grand. Thomas, Ashley, really good to see you. We'll speak again soon, I'm sure.